Annual shareholders dinner for Hartwell Industries. I walked across the ballroom to introduce myself to the man my daughter was about to marry into. I extended my hand the way my father taught me. Firm, open, no hesitation. My son-in-law's father, chairman of Hartwell, looked at my hand the way you look at something you've tracked in on your shoe. Then he turned to the table and said, loud enough for 12 people to hear, I don't shake hands with working men. I'm afraid the calluses are contagious. The table laughed. I didn't argue. I just lowered my hand, smiled, and said quietly, that's unfortunate. You just shook hands with the man who owns 40% of your company. His face went the color of old chalk. He didn't know yet how right he was about to find out he was wrong. My name is Gerald Marsh. I'm 63 years old, and for the last 22 years I've run a private equity and asset management firm out of Millbrook, Tennessee called Stonegate Capital Partners. We don't advertise. We don't sponsor college bowl games or put our name on hospital wings. We move quietly through mid-market American manufacturing, the kind of companies that make parts for parts, that employ the people everyone forgets about until the supply chain breaks and suddenly everyone remembers. I have funded textile mills in the Carolinas, auto component plants in Ohio, cold storage operations in the Central Valley. I have sat across the table from men with Harvard MBAs and men with Harvard MBAs and men with GEDs, and I will tell you without hesitation that the GED men usually understood their businesses better. Before Stonegate, I spent 14 years inside 3 different industrial conglomerates, working my way up from junior financial analyst to VP of corporate treasury. I was good at the numbers. What I was terrible at was pretending that the people running those companies were as smart as they thought they were. I watched too many men in expensive suits treat the floor supervisors and the plant managers, the people who actually kept the machines turning, like they were inconvenient furniture. I watched a man once refuse to shake hands with a union shop steward before a negotiation because, and I will quote him directly, I don't want his energy in the room. That shop steward was the only person in the building who could have prevented the strike that cost the company $11 million. He didn't prevent it. My father would have recognized that shop steward immediately. Pop ran a welding supply depot in Cookeville for 31 years. He smelled like acetylene and coffee every morning of my childhood, and he had the roughest hands I have ever seen on a living human being. He shook hands with every single person who walked through his door, the purchasing agents from the big contractors, the apprentice welders buying their first tanks, the delivery drivers who dropped things off at the loading dock out back. He said a handshake told you everything you needed to know about a man inside of 3 seconds. The ones who won't give it to you, he used to say, leaning back in his old green recliner after dinner. Those are the ones already planning something on you. I have thought about that recliner a lot these past 18 months. I have thought about Pops sitting in it on a Sunday afternoon watching the news and eating peanut butter crackers, and I have wondered what he would have made of all of it. The lawyers, the boardroom. The moment his grandson-in-law stood up in front of 12 witnesses and said something that changed everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really started, which was not the dinner and not the boardroom. It started the morning my daughter called me from Atlanta to tell me she was engaged. My daughter's name is June. She is 34, and she has her mother's stubbornness and my father's instinct for reading people. She called me on a Tuesday in March, and I could hear in her voice that she was happy in the way you're happy. When you have been afraid to hope for something for a long time, and it finally happens. She told me his name was Owen Hartwell. She told me he was 36, an architect, that he had designed sustainable housing projects in 3 states, that he was genuinely kind, and that she had never met anyone who listened to her the way he did. She did not mention at first that Owen Hartwell was the son of Preston Hartwell, chairman and controlling shareholder of Hartwell Industries, one of the largest privately held aerospace component manufacturers in the southeastern United States. June didn't mention it the way you don't mention the weather when someone tells you they're driving across the country. She assumed I already knew it was going to come up, and she wanted me to see Owen first before I saw the family. She was right to do it that way. Owen is a good man. I knew it within 20 minutes of meeting him for the first time over dinner at a barbecue place in Nashville that June had picked specifically because it was the kind of place where nobody performs. You can tell a lot about a man by whether he's comfortable in a booth with paper napkins. Owen was completely comfortable. He asked me about my work with genuine curiosity, not the courtesy curiosity where someone is waiting for their turn to speak. He asked follow-up questions. He remembered what I said at the beginning of dinner and referenced it at the end. He had his father's last name and absolutely none of his father's instincts. I met Preston Hartwell 3 weeks later at the engagement party the Hartwell family held at their estate outside Franklin. It was the kind of house that exists to remind visitors they are guests. 12,000 square feet of Tennessee stone and reclaimed timber. A driveway long enough to make you feel small before you even got out of the car. I wore my good suit, which is not a flashy suit, because I am not a flashy man. Pop raised me to believe that if you need the suit to do the talking, you haven't said enough with your mouth. Preston Hartwell was 67 that year, with silver hair and the practiced competence of a man who has spent decades in rooms where everyone else is trying to impress him. He was the third generation of Hartwells to run the company. His grandfather had started it fabricating aircraft parts during the Second World War. His father had expanded it into defense contracting in the 60s and 70s. Preston had inherited a masterpiece and spent the last 2 decades believing that made him a master. When June introduced us, Preston looked at me the way I described at the beginning of this story, not with open hostility. That would have been too honest. With a kind of polite dismissal. The look of a man who has already filed you in a category and sees no reason to revisit the decision. He asked about my little investment operation in a tone that communicated he found the answer moderately less interesting than the canapés. When I told him the name Stonegate Capital Partners, he nodded the way people nod at things they don't intend to look up later. He spent the rest of the conversation angled 15 degrees away from me, speaking to the couple to his left about a golf event in Scottsdale. I did not argue. I did not brag. I said nothing about assets under management or the 14 companies I had helped restructure in the past decade. I simply filed the look in his eyes next to every other thing I had learned about Preston Hartwell from the preliminary research my team had already run. Because here is the thing about being quiet and being invisible. They are not the same thing. Stonegate had been watching Hartwell Industries for 8 months before June's engagement dinner, not because of June, but because of the numbers. A mutual contact in the defense sector had flagged their situation to me the previous summer. Hartwell had spent the better part of a decade making acquisitions that looked impressive in press releases and catastrophic on a balance sheet. Aerospace components, yes, but also a real estate development subsidiary in Georgia that had never turned a profit. A software company in Texas that built logistics platforms for a market Hartwell didn't operate in. A catering and hospitality group that Preston had purchased because he wanted the flagship restaurant in Nashville and decided he might as well buy the whole company. By the time June called me from Atlanta, Hartwell Industries was bleeding approximately $31 million a quarter servicing the debt on those acquisitions. Their primary Department of Defense contracts were worth a combined $2.8 billion over the next 8 years. But the Pentagon had started making what procurement officers call inquiry calls, the polite government version of, "We are looking at your financials, and we do not love what we see." 3 of their Tier 2 suppliers had quietly shifted to cash-on-delivery terms. Their CFO, a careful, methodical man named Roy Etheridge, whom I had spoken to informally through an industry contact, had been running contingency plans for 2 years trying to hold the dam together while Preston added to the reservoir. When June told me she was in love with Owen Hartwell, I sat with the file on my desk for 2 hours before I made a decision. I could hand it to a competitor and walk away clean. I could recuse myself entirely. Most people in my position would have. Business and family operate by different rules, and forcing them into the same room is how you lose both. But I thought about Roy Etheridge, and the kind of tired that gets into a man's eyes when he's been honest in service of a dishonest operation. I thought about the 4,200 people on Hartwell's manufacturing floors in Tennessee, Georgia, and Alabama. And I thought about the look Preston Hartwell had given my hand at that engagement party. I stayed in the process, but I made a decision that broke my own 18-year rule about transparency and due diligence. I told my senior partner, a woman named Carol Ashby, who has been running Stonegate Steel operations since we were still working out of a converted warehouse on Commerce Street, that I would be removing myself from all primary correspondence for the duration of the diligence process. My name would not appear in meeting summaries, site visit reports, or email chains. To Hartwell's team, Stonegate's representative was Carol and Carol alone. The managing director, the man who controlled the final capital commitment, remained unnamed. I wanted to see Preston Hartwell when he didn't know I was watching. Carol spent 4 months in and out of Hartwell's offices. Her nightly calls to me were the most consistent education in a man's character I have ever received secondhand. Preston arrived late to every session. non-dramatically late, strategically late by exactly enough minutes to establish that his time was the premium commodity in the room. He referred to Carol's analysis team as the number people, with the same affect you might use for the valet. During a site visit to the Birmingham plant, he walked past the floor supervisor, a 22-year veteran named Earl, who had been keeping that facility's yield rates at the top of the division for a decade, without acknowledgement. While describing to Carol the philosophy of high-performance culture he had instilled across the organization. I added every report to a private journal. By month 3, the journal was not a record of a business negotiation. It was a character study. The capital commitment we structured was $1.8 billion, staged in performance tranches tied to governance reforms and operational milestones. The term sheet ran to 41 pages. On page 37, in plain, unambiguous English, sat the provision that my legal team had refined over 8 years and 4 previous deployments. The Conduct Integrity Clause. It stated, in language chosen specifically to be impossible to misread, that Stonegate Capital Partners reserved the unilateral right to withdraw any or all committed capital immediately and without penalty if senior leadership engaged in documented conduct that materially damaged the reputational standing of either the company or its capital partner during the active negotiation and announcement phase. Preston's lawyers called it unusual. They proposed softer language. They described it as overly broad for a transaction of this magnitude. Carol relayed their objections to me in a text. I sent back 4 words: original language or out. Preston's ego did the rest. He was so certain no one would ever pull that trigger that he signed the term sheet, including the clause, in what Carol timed at 14 seconds. She sent me a message afterward that just said, 14 seconds. I timed it. 14 seconds. My father could read a handshake in 3. Preston couldn't spare 14 to read the one document that was going to define the rest of his professional life. There was something else happening during those 4 months that I did not know about, until my senior analyst, a 31-year-old named Warren Cole, who treats a data trail the way a surgeon treats an open incision, called me on a Wednesday evening while I was sitting on my porch in Millbrook, watching the fireflies come up in the field behind the house. Warren had been running a routine security audit on Stonegate's internal document servers. We had upgraded our protocols the previous year after a minor data incident involving a vendor, and the new system flagged anomalies that the old one would have missed entirely. What Warren found was this: between June and September, 6 internal Stonegate documents had been accessed from a registered device and forwarded to an external domain. The documents included Carol's meeting schedules, our internal due diligence requirement framework, and 2 of our negotiation position papers, the documents that contained the precise thresholds of what Stonegate would accept and exactly where we were prepared to walk away from the deal. The access point was a device registered to my daughter and son-in-law's home network in Atlanta. The destination was a private executive email server registered to Preston Hartwell's personal domain. I sat on that porch for a long time after Warren's call. The fireflies kept coming up out of the grass, the way they always do in late summer in Tennessee, indifferent to the fact that something had just broken inside me. Not broken the way a deal breaks, broken the way a thing breaks when you trusted it to hold weight and it didn't. June did not know what she was doing. I am as certain of that as I am of anything I have ever believed. She is not a duplicitous person. She is a woman who loved a man and had a father-in-law who was exceptionally skilled at making betrayal feel like family loyalty. I learned later that Preston had approached her in early June, telling her that Stonegate's due diligence team seemed to be looking for reasons to decline rather than reasons to proceed. He framed the documents she was forwarding as background material that would allow Hartwell to better anticipate Stonegate's concerns. He told her she was helping both families. He told her was a standard practice in complex capital negotiations. He told her nobody would ever know. He was right about 2 of those 3 things. I instructed Warren to seal the forensic record, preserve every timestamp and forwarding address, and say nothing. I did not flag the access point. I did not change June's permissions. I let it run. If they believed they were invisible, they would keep moving. I needed the record to be complete before I moved. I did not tell June. I did not tell Owen. That was the hardest decision I made in this entire affair, harder than the capital withdrawal, harder than the boardroom, harder than the lawyers. Because June was my daughter, and she was living inside a truth she didn't know the shape of, but I had learned from a mistake I made years ago, early in Stonegate's history, when I moved on incomplete information and nearly destroyed a deal and a relationship simultaneously. I needed June to see the evidence herself, not a version of it that came from her father. The thing itself. The formal announcement was scheduled for a Thursday morning in early November at Hartwell's headquarters in Franklin. It was designed as a combined board session and employee webcast, a broadcast of stability and confidence to Hartwell's workforce and vendor partners, who had been absorbing rumors about the company's financial condition for the better part of a year. Preston would announce the Stonegate partnership, introduce the incoming operational CEO, a turnaround specialist named Marcus Webb whom I had recruited specifically for this transition, and signal to the Pentagon and their Tier 1 clients that Hartwell Industries was on solid footing. I had been a ghost for 4 months. On the morning of the announcement, I booked a flight to Nashville. The night before, I called Warren. I need the full package, I told him. Every forensic file, verified, indexed, ready to transmit on a 60-second notice. He told me it had been ready since August. I called Carol. She asked me if I was certain. I told her I had never been more certain of anything since the day I signed the papers on our first deal 22 years ago. I flew into Nashville at 6:15 in the morning. The November sky over Tennessee was the color of old pewter, low and flat, the kind of sky that doesn't promise anything. I rode to Franklin in a rental car, watching the highway emerge from the dark, the truck stops and the off-ramps and the ordinary Tuesday world that had no idea what was happening behind the glass of a 12,000 square foot stone house on the edge of a city that was about to have a very significant morning. In the front seat beside me was a sealed manila envelope. Inside it was the formal notice of Stonegate's right to act under the Conduct Integrity Clause. I had prepared it myself, sitting at my kitchen table in Millbrook the night before, drinking coffee and thinking about my father, thinking about the way he'd straighten his cap before walking into a room where he knew he was going to have to say something hard. He always said the truth was easier to carry than a comfortable lie, but only if you picked it up early enough in the morning to get a good grip on it. I walked into Hartwell's headquarters at 7:55. The lobby was a monument to everything Preston believed about himself. Photographs of fighter jets, bronze plaques commemorating Pentagon contracts, a promotional reel on the entrance screen showing precision components being manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Beautiful work. Work that existed because of 4,000 people on those floors, none of whom were pictured on the lobby wall. The executive floor smelled like new carpet and expensive coffee. A young associate named Trevor, there is always a Trevor, walked me to the main boardroom with the barely concealed anxiety of a man who understood that mornings like this one did not go sideways in small ways. Preston was already at the head of the table when the doors opened. Silver-haired, charcoal suit, the easy confidence of a man who had spent the night convinced the morning belonged to him. Roy Etheridge sat further down the table with a folder open in front of him and the eyes of a man who had been carrying other people's disasters for too long. Owen was there, 3 seats from the head, in a dark jacket I didn't recognize, his pen hovering over a notepad, his brow furrowed the way it gets when he is trying to solve something. Marcus Webb sat near the center, patient and watchful, a professional who understood that every room he walked into was already mid-conversation. When the doors opened and I walked in behind the associate, most heads lifted and returned to their business. A man in a plain jacket carrying a manila envelope does not demand a room's attention. Preston glanced up, registered my presence with roughly the interest he would give a catering delivery, and turned back to the board member he was speaking to. I did not stop at the side table where the associate gestured. I did not leave the envelope at the credenza near the door. I walked to the far end of the table, to a chair without a nameplate, the one that exists for the extra person who might need to be present, but who is not expected to be heard. I pulled it out and sat down. I placed the envelope on the table in front of me, aligned with the edge, and folded my hands on top of it. Owen looked up. I watched it happen. Recognition, then confusion, then the kind of careful stillness a man develops when the variables in a room have just changed faster than he can update his math. He looked at me, then at the envelope, then back at his notepad, his knuckles whitening slightly at the edge of the page. He stayed still. He was a man caught in the middle of a storm whose weather system he didn't yet understand. I extended my hand toward Marcus Webb. "Welcome," I said, my voice quiet and even. "I'm Gerald." Marcus took the handshake without hesitation, the grip of a man who shakes hands with everyone. "Marcus," he said, and went back to his materials. The ripple in the room reached Preston within 4 seconds. He had stopped speaking. He was looking at me with the specific irritation of a man who has found an anomaly in what was supposed to be a scripted morning. He took in the picture. The man in the plain jacket who had ignored his unspoken instructions and sat at his executive table and shaken hands with his incoming CEO as though he belonged. He set his coffee cup down. He straightened his jacket, and in the particular resonant baritone of a man who has spent his life deciding which rooms he tolerates and which ones he owns, he spoke. "You can leave those documents with the associate," Preston said, not quite looking at me, the way you address someone you have classified as staff without wanting to formalize the transaction. "We'll collect them before the webcast starts." I did not respond. "I said you can leave the documents at the door." Preston's voice sharpened slightly. He was looking at me fully now, the irritation shifting into something more deliberate. Around the table, heads had turned. The cameras on their tripods continued to blink their steady red. I did not leave the documents. I did not stand up. I held his gaze the way my father taught me. Not aggressive, not deferential. Just present. Just completely, unmovably present. Preston Hartwell made a decision in that moment. I could see it in the way his expression settled. He had calculated, as I would learn later, he calculated everything, that I was trapped by love and family and the weight of my daughter's happiness. He believed that whatever happened in this room, I would absorb it, because the alternative cost more than I was willing to pay. He turned to the board members. He raised his voice by just enough to make it a performance. "In this company," Preston said, his tone carrying the casual authority of a man announcing the weather, "we maintain certain standards about who belongs at the leadership table. The working class has its place, and this room isn't it." He looked back at me with something that was almost a smile. "Take your papers and wait outside." The silence was absolute. Roy Etheridge did not move. Marcus Webb set his pen down very carefully. Owen's face went the color of the November sky outside the window. And somewhere in the back of the room, a young communications assistant who had been adjusting a camera mount stopped adjusting it. The cameras did not stop recording. The webcast was live. I waited 4 full seconds. 4 seconds in a room like that is a geological age. I wanted every camera to hold the picture. Preston's easy contempt, my complete stillness. I wanted the record to be unambiguous. Then I stood up. Not quickly, not dramatically, the way my father used to stand up from his green recliner when something needed to be handled. The unhurried movement of a man who has already decided what he's going to do and doesn't need the motion to carry any additional weight. I picked up the manila envelope. I walked the length of the table. I placed it directly in front of Preston, within his reach, and returned to my chair. Then I spoke. "Before this meeting proceeds," I said, my voice carrying exactly as far as I needed it to, "there is something this room needs to understand about who is in it." Preston turned from the screen slowly. "Support staff do not address the board," he said. "If you have materials to deliver, deliver them and go." "My name is Gerald Marsh," I said. "I am the founder and managing director of Stonegate Capital Partners. I am the person who controls the $1.8 billion this entire announcement is built around, and I've been sitting in that chair for the last 20 minutes listening to you define who belongs at a leadership table." The reaction moved around the room in waves. Roy Etheridge's hand went to his folder. 3 board members began turning pages simultaneously, searching for the signature on the term sheet. Marcus Webb sat back in his chair, a man watching tectonic plates move. Owen lifted his head from his notepad and stared at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before. Not shock exactly, but the look of a man realizing the room he thought he knew had always been larger than he'd been shown. Preston did not speak for several seconds. I watched his face move through a recalibration. He was a man whose math had just failed him, and he was searching for the error. "You're telling me you control the funding," Preston said finally. "Not a question. A data point being processed. I'm telling you that without Stonegate's primary commitment, every tranche of this deal stops tonight," I said. "You've known for 4 months who held that commitment. What you failed to understand was who you were speaking to when you spoke about the working class and who belongs in this room." I looked at the cameras. "You said it clearly. You said it in front of 4 cameras on a live webcast that is currently streaming to your employees and the procurement officers at the Pentagon who have been wondering for 6 months whether Hartwell Industries is a stable partner." Preston's color changed. It happened slowly, the way color drains from a thing when the heat goes out of it. He looked at the cameras. He looked at Roy. He looked at the board members who were no longer looking at him. Roy cleared his throat. The sound was quiet and definitive. He opened his folder to a marked page. "There is a provision in the term sheet," Roy said, "that the board needs to hear before we proceed." He read it aloud. Every word. The room heard it the way rooms hear things that were always true but are only now being acknowledged. After Roy finished, Preston attempted the same moves I have seen losing men attempt in every negotiation I have sat in for 22 years. He said the language was standard. He said I had a conflict of interest as the father of his son's wife. He said we had a family relationship that superseded a legal clause. He looked at Owen when he said it. The specific predatory look of a man calling in a debt he has no right to collect. Owen did not move for a long moment. He looked at his father-in-law. He looked at his father-in-law. He looked at me, and then, in a voice that was quiet enough that the cameras had to work to catch it, he said, "He is my father's family. And, in my family, we shake hands with everybody." It was not a dramatic speech. It was 4 seconds of a 36-year-old architect sitting in a charcoal boardroom telling his father who he had decided to be. It was the kind of thing that doesn't need volume to land. It landed. I excused myself to make 2 calls. The first call took 40 seconds. I told Carol to execute the withdrawal. Full amount. Conduct integrity clause and vote. Formal notice to Hartwell's general counsel within the hour. She told me Warren had already time-stamped the webcast footage at the precise moment of Preston's remarks. She told me there would be no legal foothold. The second call took considerably longer, because it was not about capital. I called Warren. I told him to send the forensic package, the complete file, every IP trace and timestamp and forwarding address to Roy Etheridge's secure inbox. I told him to send it now. Warren asked if I was certain. He knew what it meant. Once Roy had it, it became part of the corporate record. June was going to find out in the middle of all of this. I told him June deserved to know the truth, not a version of it that arrived at a dinner table 6 months from now. I told him to send it. I stood in the hallway for a while after that, looking out at the Franklin skyline. The November light gray and flat over the limestone hills. I thought about my daughter making coffee in her kitchen in Atlanta, not knowing yet that the morning she had assumed was going to be the beginning of something was actually the middle. When I walked back through the boardroom doors, Roy's phone was already lit. Then the board member to his left, then 2 more in sequence. The sound of a room receiving information it was not prepared for. The capital withdrawal took 5 minutes to formalize. Preston's suspension, a 6-2 board vote with Roy abstaining on procedural grounds, took 11. Marcus Webb's appointment was formally placed on hold, pending capital restructuring, a reality he accepted with the professional grace of a man who had restructured things in worse conditions than this. Preston signed the suspension acknowledgement form without ceremony. He straightened his jacket. He walked out of the room. Not a single person watched him go. Owen was in the lobby when I came down. He was sitting in one of the low chairs near the east entrance, jacket on, tie loosened by 1 notch, staring at the floor. He had not left the building. I sat down next to him without a greeting, the way Pop used to sit next to me on the porch steps when something was wrong and the words weren't ready yet. He spoke first. "How long did you know?" he asked. His voice was level, but there was something underneath it. The sound of a man who was holding his emotions the way you hold a full glass when you are walking carefully. "Long enough to be certain before I moved," I said. "Did you know what he was going to say this morning in there?" I thought about that honestly. "I knew who he was," I said. "I had 4 months of evidence about who he was when he thought no one important was watching. I didn't know which particular weapon he was going to pick." Owen nodded slowly. He looked at his hands. "June doesn't know yet." "She will soon," I said. "I needed the record to be complete. I needed her to see the evidence itself, Owen, not a version of it for me, the thing itself." He sat with that for a while. "You should have told me," he said finally. Not angrily, just factually. "You're right," I said. "I should have. That one I'm going to have to live with." He looked up then. He looked at me the way a man looks at another man when he has made a decision about him. "My grandfather," he said, "the one who started the company, the one it was actually supposed to be about. He used to say the measure of a man was how he treated the people who couldn't do anything for him. "Your grandfather sounds like he was someone worth knowing," I said. Owen stood up. He extended his hand. Not as a social gesture, not as a reflex. He held it out the deliberate way. Open, forward, the way a man offers a handshake when he means it to say something specific. I stood up and took it. His grip was the grip of a man who has been thinking about what it means to offer it. "Thank you," he said, "for not letting this become something we just lived inside of." I held it one beat longer than necessary. "Your grandfather would have been proud of you today," I said. "The way you sat in that room, the way you didn't." He walked toward the exit, and I watched him go. I knew what was waiting. I knew the conversation in Atlanta was coming, and I knew it was not going to be simple or clean. There are no clean endings in a story that starts with a man deciding to use his daughter as a tool. The endings are just different kinds of continuing. June knew before I called. She had watched the webcast. She had seen the share price drop. She had 17 missed calls from her father-in-law that she had not answered. When I got to Atlanta that evening, she was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands around a mug that had gone cold. Owen was there. The three of us sat in a room with the weight of things that were already broken, and we let the silence do the first part of the work. June told me she had understood, in the summer, that something had shifted in what her father-in-law was asking her to do. She told me she had stopped forwarding documents in September when she realized the questions Preston was asking her to answer were not the questions of a man trying to help the deal close. They were the questions of a man reading a playbook. She told me she had not known how to stop what had already been started. She also told me something I had not expected. She handed me a folder she had pulled from the desk in Owen's home office. She had been collecting things since August, communication she had seen on Preston's personal device during family visits, accessed inadvertently through a shared cloud account Preston had never thought to secure because he did not believe anyone in his circle would ever look. Inside was evidence of a pattern, 2 other capital negotiations in the previous 4 years, both involving insider access through a trusted relationship, both resolved in Preston's favor because the other party had no idea they were being read. And at the bottom of the folder, 1 email from 5 years before June and Owen's first date. Preston, writing to his personal assistant, noting that Owen had begun seeing a woman from Tennessee, that her father ran a private equity operation, that the relationship was worth watching. He had known from the beginning. He had guided it. I sat with that folder in my hands for a long time. Then I placed it on the table and looked at my daughter. "He thought you were his asset," I said. "He was wrong about almost everything in this situation. He was most wrong about that." June looked at me across the table with her mother's eyes. "I'm sorry, Dad," she said. "Not to fix it, just because it's true." "I know," I said. The lawsuit arrived 4 days later. Preston was suing on conflict of interest grounds, claiming the family relationship invalidated the entire agreement and the withdrawal. His legal theory was that my undisclosed connection to Owen rendered the capital commitment and its provisions legally void. It was a strategy built on one assumption, that I had not documented everything. He had never met Warren. The counter-evidence we assembled in 72 hours was comprehensive enough that Preston's attorneys withdrew the lawsuit on a Sunday, without conditions, without counteroffers, without a statement. They simply withdrew it. The legal equivalent of a man leaving a room without saying goodbye because there is nothing left to say. Preston Hartwell resigned as chairman of Hartwell Industries on December 8th. No public statement. No farewell remarks. A digital filing and a name removed from a door. Roy Etheridge was appointed interim executive chairman the following Monday and immediately opened exploratory discussions with 2 alternative capital sources. Marcus Webb, to his considerable credit, agreed to stay on in an advisory capacity during the transition at a reduced retainer. 4,200 people kept their jobs. A reporter called me in the 3rd week of December. She asked whether any part of it had been personal. I told her my father ran a welding supply depot for 31 years and shook hands with every person who walked through his door without exception. I told her he said that a man who won't give you a handshake has already told you his price. I told her Preston Hartwell had told me his price at an engagement party 3 years before the boardroom, and that I had simply made sure when the time came, he paid it. She thanked me. I set the phone down. A message from Owen came through that same evening. "June and I are starting counseling on Thursday. I wanted you to know. Also, the housing project in Chattanooga got approved today. Groundbreaking in the spring. Thank you, Gerald, for the folder. For everything. I read it twice. I typed back. Your grandfather would have liked you a great deal. I'm glad I got to find out the same thing. I set the phone face down on the desk. Outside, the December sky over Millbrook was doing the thing it does in winter, pulling all the light into itself and leaving the fields silver and still. The house was quiet. The deal was closed. The wrong kind of closed, and the right kind. My father used to say that integrity wasn't something you proved once in the big moments. He said it was the thing you either had or didn't have in all the small moments. And the big moments just made it visible to everyone else. He said it holding a cup of coffee on a Tuesday morning, and he said it at the end of a workday with grease on his hands. And I do not think he ever once imagined I would spend 63 years trying to understand everything that meant. I think I'm still learning. I have been turning this over in my mind for months now, trying to find the clean lesson in it, the tidy moral that wraps everything up with a bow. I haven't found one. What I found instead is something harder and more honest than that. Preston Hartwell was not an unusual man. That's the part that stays with me. He was not a monster or an outlier. He was the product of 67 years of never once being required to reckon with the consequences of how he treated people. Every room he walked into, the room rearranged itself around him. Every person he dismissed stayed dismissed. Every handshake he withheld cost him nothing. Until it did. That's how cause and effect actually works, in my experience. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a warning label. It accumulates quietly in the background, in the 14 seconds a man spends signing a document he never read, in the look he gives a stranger at an engagement party, in the way he instructs his daughter-in-law to forward files she didn't understand were weapons. And then one Tuesday morning in November, it walks through a boardroom door in a plain jacket carrying a manila envelope. And the bill comes due all at once. I spent a long time asking myself whether I handled it the right way, whether I should have confronted Preston earlier, protected June from the weight of what she unwittingly carried, warned Owen before he had to sit in that room and watch it happen in real time. I still don't have a clean answer. What I know is that I waited until the evidence was complete because I had learned, the hard way, and years before this, that moving on incomplete truth causes a different kind of damage. The truth I gave June and Owen was not comfortable, but it was whole. They could build something on it. You cannot build on a version. The thing I keep returning to is Owen, 36 years old, sitting at a table where his father was trying to use him as leverage, and he chose in about 4 seconds who he was going to be. He didn't make a speech about it. He just said what was true. That kind of clarity is not an accident. It's the result of 1,000 small decisions a person makes before the moment that tests them. Decisions about what they value, who they listen to, what they're willing to carry. Owen had been making those decisions quietly his whole life. The boardroom just made them visible. My father would have understood that immediately. He did not raise me with a philosophy or a system. He raised me by example, shaking hands with a delivery driver the same way he shook hands with the bank president. He didn't teach me integrity as a concept. He showed me what it looked like as a daily practice. Unremarkable and consistent in a welding supply depot in Cookeville that nobody outside of 3 counties ever heard of. That's where I learned that character is not what you perform when the cameras are on. It's what you default to when you think nobody's watching. Preston spent 4 months assuming nobody important was watching. He was wrong about who mattered in that room from the very beginning. I'm 63 years old. I have sat in a lot of boardrooms. I have watched a lot of men confuse power with permanence. The ones who last, the ones who build something that actually survives them, are almost never the loudest voices at the table. They are the ones who understand that how you treat the people who can't do anything for you is the truest measure of the judgment you'll exercise over the people who can. Preston never learned that. I hope the cost of not learning it was worth something to somebody. I hope, most of all, it was worth something to June and Owen. That's the only part of this I care about now.